Hi again. Well, I am so excited to introduce our guest preacher for today. Andy Crouch and his family have become just really good friends of our whole family over the past few years. And, Andy is always on the move. He is always just using his creative eagle eyes to kind of search for what is like the best of what could be happening in terms of like hopeful, redemptive work. And right now, Andy is the partner for theology and culture at Praxis, which is an organization that works towards redemptive entrepreneurship. And he's authored several books, one of which, The Tech-Wise Family. Our family ministry is going to have a book discussion on that in November. And another one of his recent books, Strong and Weak, has been one of the most just influential, just theological and like pastoral thoughts that have shaped how I've pastored over the past couple of years. And so, Andy, you are just an incredibly precise and faithful and winsome writer and speaker, and we're so blessed to have you to join us at Blue Root Vineyard. So welcome, Andy.
Way to make an entrance. Thank you, Kathy. I am so just grateful to be here with you. Caleb and Kathy have become dear friends since they arrived, and maybe part of why they've become dear friends is that when my wife and I arrived 15 years ago in Swarthmore, where we live now, the very first person who reached out to us who wasn't family, it was actually my wife's hometown, but I was brand new, and the first person I got an email from was this guy named Mark Tyndall. Never heard of him, but he was starting this church called the Blue Root Vineyard, and we had like one mutual friend, and he just heard a new family was in town, and that friendship has been one of the great, great gifts of my life, and getting to be part of what's happening here. It's not our home church, but we do feel at home with you, and you are part of our family in a very real way, and we're so glad to be on mission together in Delaware County with you. And then when Mark or Kathy or whoever it was said, we're doing a series on film in the fall, would you like to come speak? I said, I would love to be part of that, and I know exactly what I want to talk about. So here I am. I think it's week 2 of the series. There's a couple more weeks coming. But I knew what I wanted to talk about, which is, to me, one of the greatest stories of creative output and really creative transformation of a genre that's ever happened in history, and it happened while I was alive, which I just think it's amazing to be alive while people are creating lastingly good stuff. People my age who have lived through the U2 story know some of this feeling, right? Like they were actually writing those songs while we were alive, and I feel that way about a movie studio that took a genre that people had pretty much given up on as anything you could do anything really creative with, and over about 15 years, from 1995 to 2010, did amazing things. And it's the film studio Pixar. Founded by Steve Jobs, based not in Hollywood, but in Emeryville, California, Northern California. And from Toy Story, 1995, to Toy Story 3 in 2010, and all the extraordinary films in the middle. The Incredibles, WALL-E, Cars, not so much, but that's all right. I mean, everybody gets an off day, right? Did something quite amazing. Now, here's the problem with Pixar. I say the names of these films, or I say the name of the studio, and people think, oh, well, those are children's films. And so you might be a parent with, let's say you haven't had kids. And you think, well, those are for families to watch. And maybe you've never watched these movies, in which case you are missing out on some of the best film ever created in any genres, right? Now, you might have grown up with these films, and you're an adult now, you've put away childish things, so you don't want to hear about Pixar. You're like, I watched Finding Nemo 3,000 times. What can you tell me about that? Or worse, you may currently be a parent of small children who are requesting Finding Nemo 3,000 times, and the last thing you want to do when you come to church is hear more about these children's films. But there's more there. And it's because actually what Pixar did is they broke the rules, the fundamental rules of children's movies, and they decided not to make animated children's films. Instead, they made animated films that are for everyone. So the formula for a lot of animated films, especially those that are aimed at, well, almost all of them aimed at kids, right? If you can actually see this in action whenever the next Pixar film comes out. And by the way, in the last few years, it's not as great as it used to be, I have to say. Like Incredibles 2, probably not as great as Incredibles, who knows? But you go to a Pixar film, and of course they show you trailers beforehand for all the other animated films that are coming out, and they're horrible. Like, they're genuinely horrible. Many involve chipmunks. They're full of, here's the formula. They're full of like sort of stupid physical humor and fart jokes that the children will find funny, and the parents will not find this stuff interesting or funny. And so then they put in this layer of innuendo that will go totally over the kids' heads, but that the parents will get. So it's like this two-storied approach to storytelling that's really kind of immature stuff down here, and sort of inappropriate, way too mature stuff. And the kids are like, "Mommy, Daddy, why are you laughing?" "I'll tell you later." But it isn't something both generations can enjoy. And Pixar decided to do something totally different, to make films that from minute 1 to minute 120, an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old could watch and say, that was worth watching. It was funny. It did have elements of kind of humor and all kinds of jokes and fun, but it also went deep. And the fascinating thing is that this is the only studio ever, really, that had a significant number of followers of Christ in senior creative leadership. Many of the senior people at Pixar are very open about their personal faith in Jesus, who is the reason we're here today. And so, Brad Bird, writer-director of The Incredibles, Andrew Stanton, writer-director of WALL-E, Pete Docter, writer-director of Up, Pete Docter, now a very senior creative official at Pixar. These and many others at Pixar, way more than any other company, making movies, are people who share a Christian faith. And the brilliant thing is, they didn't make Christian movies, because Christian movies are generally terrible. They're shallow, they're sentimental, they're sort of wish fulfillment for Christians. They're bad movies, and they didn't make anything like that. Instead, Pete Docter says every Pixar film is actually about the same topic, same question. What is it to be a human being? They're all about what is it to be a human being, our loves, our longings, our losses. And even though they're told through fish and robots and whole collections of toys, they're actually all about our shared human experience. And told in a way that when you are a Christian, you see, actually this is rooted very deeply in what we believe to be most true about the world and what it is to be a human being in the world. So I was very excited to talk to you about a Pixar film, but then the question is which one? Because there are a lot of good ones, and you can get our family going. Like if we run out of other things to talk about, we have this conversation over and over. Which is the greatest Pixar film of all, right? And we can take a whole dinner for this question. And some of us will argue Toy Story 3, which, by the way, almost never are the sequels better than the originals. And this is the amazing thing. Toy Story was very fine. Toy Story 2 was quite good. Toy Story 3 is an exceptional movie in its own right, and as the culmination of this series. But then others in our family, I am partial to The Incredibles because ensemble cast, everyone with its own amazing art, it's just incredible. But today I decided I would talk about another one that I think is in the running for the very best, and it is this movie, Ratatouille. Yes! All right, we have a few Ratatouille partisans in the room. It's a movie about the dish, Ratatouille, the sort of peasant dish, but it's also a movie about a rat. The rat's name is Remy, voiced by Patton Oswalt, a really great performance and a great, great character. He's a rat with a very unusual ability and interest. He has great taste, like literal taste for food. He's got a discerning palate, and he's come to love food. The only problem is he's a rat, and rats don't get to eat great food usually, right? And he actually wants his family to fall in love with the food the way that he has, but they have no interest in his gift for fine food. And so they put him to work doing the only thing they can think of for a rat with a discerning palate, which is simply figuring out which things in the dumpster are poisoned and which are not. I mean, what a letdown, right? And this sets up Remy's problem, and we meet him early in the film. He kind of introduces himself, and then we kind of see him with his family and how they see his gift. Let's watch just a little clip here from the film.
This much I knew. If you are what you eat, then I only want to eat the good stuff. But to my dad...
Food is fuel. You get picky about what you put in the tank, your engine is gonna die. Now shut up and eat your garbage.
Look, if we're going to be thieves, why not steal the good stuff in the kitchen? Where nothing is poison?
First of all, we are not thieves. Secondly, stay out of the kitchen and away from the humans. It's dangerous.
I know I'm supposed to hate humans, but there's something about them. They don't just survive, they discover, they create. I mean, just look at what they do with food.
How can I describe it? Good food is like music you can taste, color you can smell. There is excellence all around you. You need only be aware to stop and savor it.
Oh, Gusteau was right. Oh, yeah. Oh, amazing. Each flavor was totally unique. But combine one flavor with another, and something new was created. So now, I had a secret life. The only one who knew about it was Emil. Hey, Emil! I found a mushroom. Come on, you're good at hiding food. Help me find a good place to put this.
So this is Remy, goes searching for mushrooms in his spare time. He has a brother, Emil. Emil loves food, but not in the right way. Like, just loves anything. He'll eat anything, no taste. Of course, Dad's sitting there saying, "Shut up and eat your garbage," which I think is one of the great lines in all of family film, right? And what is Remy going to do? Well, this is everything you need to have a great story. And so what I want to do, actually, for the next few minutes is take you through this story about this rat who imagines being a chef, who's been inspired by this chef, Auguste Gusteau, an awesome name, by the way, who was the chef of the greatest restaurant in Paris and has this TV show that Remy has somehow stumbled upon and a cookbook called Anyone Can Cook. And of course, the question is, can a rat cook? I mean, how about a rat? And Auguste Gusteau has inspired Remy with this vision. And this is where all stories begin. What I want to do is not just talk about the movie Ratatouille, though we could just go through the movie sort of on its own terms, but I actually want to talk about the way all stories work, the structure of every good story, because Ratatouille turns out in a way to obey this structure and fill it out in a beautiful way. And I'm not making this up. The person who did make it up, or I really would say discovered it, is this French structuralist named A.J. Gréma, who wrote this book, Du Sang, which I came across in Richard Hayes' book, The Faith of Jesus Christ. And it's just a very simple model of how every story you've ever enjoyed actually works. And once you have seen this, you'll be able to go back and look at any story you love and see how all stories basically follow a pretty straightforward pattern. Every story begins with a sender who seeks to get something, we'll call it the object, to a receiver. It has some destination, a person or a place where it needs to go. And in order to get that object to the receiver, the sender sends the subject. And the subject is what we often think of as the hero or the protagonist of a story. It's the main figure in the story. And the goal is for the subject to actually succeed in this mission of getting the object to the receiver. So let's think about a film or a story that probably most of us are familiar with. Lord of the Rings. Let's just think about so what's the object in Lord of the Rings? The ring. Where does it need to go? Mordor, Mount Doom. Who is sent? Who's the subject who's sent to take the ring? I don't know why I touch my ring when I talk about the Ring of Power. This is not the Ring of Power. Who's sent? Frodo, the Hobbit, right? And who's the sender in the Lord of the Rings? Gandalf, I guess, right? Gandalf, sort of. But the sender in a great story is often something more than just a mere human being. Don't you sense in Lord of the Rings that Gandalf, though he is kind of the one who gets things in motion, is actually in service in some way of something deeper and better and bigger than himself. And so the sender is often a little like God or a little like a divine figure. And then along come, as the subject seeks to get the object of the receiver, along come both helpers and opponents. That is, figures in the story who assist in the mission and figures in the story who resist and seek to undermine the mission. So the helper in Lord of the Rings, the main helper would be Sam, the little gardener hobbit, who is Frodo's companion. And opponents in Lord of the Ring, what would be opponents? Orcs, ringwraiths, and another hobbit, Gollum, right? The fallen hobbit, the corrupted hobbit, who actually, interestingly, is in a way both helper and opponent in the Lord of the Rings. And if I were doing the Lord of the Rings talk, that would be the whole talk about how Gollum is like the key figure, but I'm not doing that talk, so I will keep going. So if you have all these, you have the ingredients of a story if you do it 3 times. Grandma's great insight was this basic pattern in all of the great stories plays itself out 3 times. We could call it 3 acts. So I want to show you how this works in the movie Ratatouille. Act 1. Where does Act 1 begin? Well, Remy is going to be our subject. He's our hero, the rat, who has encountered the chef Gusteau, who I put in parentheses because he's actually off the scene, out of the picture. He's dead. He died, by the way, because his restaurant, which had been the greatest in Paris, lost a star in the most important star ratings of Paris. The judgment of the fearsome food critic Anton Ego, who decides that Gusteau is lost his touch, and Gusteau is so heartbroken at the criticism he receives that he dies before the action of the movie begins. So he's now just a figure on TV, and eventually, kind of in Remy's imagination, he's a little animated ghost-like character, Gusteau the ghost. And Gusteau has instilled in Remy this vision of bringing cuisine to ratkind, to get his fellow rats to actually love food. Unlikely mission, very difficult mission, likely to fail. And many good stories begin with a mission that both is a great idea, but very unlikely to happen. And then, does it happen in Act 1? It doesn't, because Remy has opponents. And his opponents actually are the very ones who ought to be his helpers. His family are his opponents. So his father, shut up and eat your garbage. His brother, the glutton, they're of no use in accomplishing this. And as Act 1 ends, Remy has no helpers. There's no one to assist him, to go along with him in pursuing this mission. And so Act 1 ends, actually, the way all Act 1s end is with frustrated desire, a mission that's not fulfilled, a quest that seems like it's going to fail. It's the moment in Lord of the Rings where the Fellowship of the Ring breaks up at the end of the first book, the first movie, and these 2 little hobbits set out on this little boat, and what are the chances? Like, all the helpers are gone, all the opponents are still in place, this huge asymmetry between possibility and likelihood of failure. And this is where Act 1 ends in Ratatouille. Remy's family gets swept down a sewer drain for reasons I won't go into right now. So does he, but he gets totally separated from them. He's all alone. Not only has he lost his family, he's lost any chance to ever pursue his dream, and that's how Act 1 ends. And this resonates with us, we human beings, because all of us live stories too, and all of us have been in or are in Act 1 at some point. You've all been here, where you had some sense of mission, some sense of possibility, some sense of desire for something or someone, and then you get to a point where it just seems like, I can never get there. I'll never make it. There's too much opposition. I have no help. All of us have experienced this, right? We've all been in Act 1. So in Act 2, Remy is going to need something he doesn't currently have. And the interesting thing about what happens in Act 2 is that Remy, who's the subject of Act 1, he actually moves to a different position because he needs something to fulfill his mission. And so Gusteau, the sender, is going to stay the same, but Gusteau is now actually going to give Remy what he needs. Remy needs an opportunity to actually cook, to actually make something out of food, strawberry and brie and all these other ingredients. And in order to get that, someone's going to need to be sent. A new subject is going to have to appear to give him the opportunity he needs. It comes in the form of a washer boy in Gusteau's restaurant, whose name is Linguini. And Linguini is not a very promising figure. He's totally uncoordinated, not super bright, I think it's fair to say. but well-intentioned. And he and Remy meet. Remy is washed down the sewer drain into Paris and eventually meets up with Linguini and Remy realizes, and Linguini realize that together they might be able to give Remy the opportunity to cook. So Remy camps out inside Linguini's chef's hat on top of his head and watches and can kind of control what Linguini does. And Linguini now is going to get a helper in the form of this very suave French chef named Colette, who knows what she's doing in the kitchen and teaches Linguini, and through Linguini, in a way, teaches Remy all about French cuisine. But, of course, for this to be a good story, there also has to be an opponent. And there is, in the form of the current owner of Gusteau's, Chef Skinner, a very alarming name for someone who owns a restaurant. Skinner doesn't have any interest in fine food. He only has interest in profit and money and commercializing the legacy of Gusteau. And he senses there is a rat in the kitchen, and he has no interest in letting Linguini begin to cook. But nonetheless, as Act 2 plays out, they actually do get an opportunity. And against Skinner's opposition, Linguini, guided by Remy, the great chef, and taught by Colette, helped by Colette, starts to create cuisine that's as good as anyone's ever tasted at Gusteau's restaurant. And that sets up Act 3, where we now have all the supporting cast that we need for something to change in the story, for maybe the original mission to be fulfilled. And by the way, I think this should resonate with us too, because I think we're all also in Act 2 in our lives stories, in two ways. One is, you may be the supporting cast in someone else's story. It's so easy for us to make our lives all about us, right? Like we watch movies and we identify with the hero. But what if we are actually in the world, in part, to actually be the one in someone else's Act 2 that unlocks opportunity for them, unlocks possibility for them. We prayed for Unity Ministries in Chester today that comes alongside kids who started out, as every child does, with this sense of purpose and mission and possibility. But their lives have taken all kinds of wrong turns or hard turns. And what if part of our story is actually to be the supporting cast in other people's story? And you also are in Act 2 in the sense that you're not just the one who has to get things done, but you've moved up to this space of being the receiver. You are able to receive something. And the reason I know this is true of you, even though I don't know you personally, is that you're here in this room. And because you're in this room, in this church community on Sunday morning, that is a sign that you are not alone in carrying out your mission. Around you in this room are people who could become the helpers in your story that you need. And more importantly in this room is the presence of God who wants to actually give you everything you need to be what you're called to be. And part of why I think we come to worship on Sunday, part of it, is to receive, so that we're not just the hero and the subject all the time, but we're here just to realize I've actually been given what I need to do what I'm called to do. So this sets up Act 3. In Act 3, we're going to go back to the original mission, and we'll see if we can get it done. Remy will be the subject again. We still have this vision of fine cuisine being made at the highest level. Now we're in Paris. Where else to do it? Where else better to do it? And now Remy has helpers. He's got Linguini. He's got the opportunity he needs. And in a very cool moment in the film, he actually is reunited with his family. And this is kind of the first big reversal. We talk about reversals in stories where his family, who were against him when they all lived out in the country, had no interest. But in the city of Paris, they come to realize Remy really does have a gift. And they all show up en masse, like dozens, hundreds of rats. It's quite alarming to see them swarming through the kitchen and making food with Remy, but that's what they do. They become his helpers. They're like his sous chefs, his assistant chefs. And so now they've got a chance to make some really good food, but there is still opposition. Indeed, the opposition increases because Skinner is still around, still opposed to the mission, and also appears on the scene, the fearsome food critic Anton Ego. Linguini and Remy have been making really good food. The word has got around. The food at Gusteau's is better than it's ever been. Anton Ego, who destroyed the reputation of Auguste Gusteau, wants to come back and do a new review. And we meet him, and I think you'll see that now we've got a real opponent.
You are Monsieur Linguini.
Oh, hello.
Pardon me for interrupting your premature celebration, but I thought it only fair to give you a sporting chance as you are new to this game.
Game?
Yes, and you've been playing without an opponent, which is, as you may have guessed, against the rules.
You're Anton Ego.
You're slow for someone in the fast lane.
And you're thin for someone who likes food.
I don't like food, I love it. If I don't love it, I don't swallow. I will return tomorrow night with high expectations. Pray you don't disappoint me.
So Anton Ego is coming to dinner, and he wants to taste Linguini's, really Remy's food. And what happens in Act 3 is the stakes get higher. We now have a worthy opponent. If you're going to have a great story, you have to have a great opponent. Anton Ego is a great opponent. I don't like food, I love it. And by the way, do you remember what he says early on as he's introducing himself? He says, you have been playing without an opponent, which, as you may have guessed, is against the rules. What rules? The rule of story. It's not a good story unless there's an opponent in the story. And Anton Ego showing up and saying, show me what you've got, I don't like it, I love it, and if I don't love it, I don't swallow, sets up the ultimate act of Ratatouille, where they actually make the dish Ratatouille and serve it to Anton Ego all alone in a dining room and see what the great critic is going to say. Now, at this moment, the best thing in the movie happens, and because not all of you have seen the movie because you thought it was a children's movie, I'm not going to describe it for you in detail. I'm not going to spoil the very moment. I mean, I'm going to tell you the outline of what happens. But it is one of the most beautiful moments I've ever seen in a movie. Because Anton Ego, with all of his critical powers ready to go, takes a bite of the ratatouille that Remy and all his rat family have prepared. And something transformative happens in Anton Ego's life, and it involves grace and mercy and love. And he is transformed. It's this beautiful picture of a heart that was hard in a moment softening. And he's holding his critic's pen, ready to write down his notes. And he has this beautiful, I'm not going to describe it anymore, but trust me, it's a beautiful moment of just a person like being recalled to real life and real love. And yes, it's the food that tastes good, but it goes deeper than that. And he lets go of the pen. And in this great homage to 2001: A Space Odyssey, the pen tumbles in slow motion, end over end, and falls on the ground like this black obelisk, making this thudding sound. And the critic's pen is gone, and the critic is gone. And Anton Ego is suddenly a genuine lover of food and lover of life because he's been loved and he's tasted love. And this is the climax of the movie. It's the moment when you just, laugh and weep at the same time. And Anton Ego goes home and writes his review. And his review takes the form of an extended critical essay on the role of the critic in fine art. And for roughly 3 minutes, Peter O'Toole reads this essay in a monologue, a voiceover. And think about this, like this is a children's film, and I promise you, when you get to that point, you get this sophisticated account of why you actually need critics for great art to happen, and that the role of a critic is to celebrate and defend what's new in the world and say, this is worth trying. And he gives the restaurant, of course, a glowing review, and the doors are flooded, and they go on to make food night after night. It's a great, great moment. And the key thing is that Anton Ego switches sides. He goes from being an opponent to being a helper. I hope you caught the animation. It's very expensive to do that. So from opponent to helper, he becomes their ally. He becomes the one who advances their mission. The very one they were most afraid of turns out to be the one who can open the door for Remy not actually just to create cuisine for his fellow rats, but it actually turns out there's a bigger mission for Remy. It's to create cuisine for us, for human beings. And so they open up this little restaurant, and every night they get to serve food, and that's the way the movie ends. And it ends with what I have come to call the happier ending. It's happier than you could have imagined at the beginning. So sort of cheap films and cheap stories have happy endings. A happy ending is an ending you can predict from the beginning. You see the setup, like, so think about like bad romantic comedies, right? You know, you meet the girl, you meet the guy, they meet cute, they start to get to know each other. There's this other guy who's obviously going to be competition, and you, like, within 10 minutes, you're like, oh, I know how this is going to end. They're going to get together, he's going to be a problem, you know. And sure enough, it happens, like happy ending, great, right? And you never think about that movie or talk about that movie again. Great stories have an ending you never could have predicted at the beginning. It's better than you could imagine. And at the beginning of Ratatouille, there's no way you could imagine how it's going to end, this opportunity he's going to get, and all the great food he's going to create for human beings, not just for his fellow rats. It's a happier ending. And this is what we're looking for in our stories, right? Is a happier ending that's both unpredictable and inevitable. Like, I never saw it coming, and it couldn't have been any other way. Now, you may be thinking, this is very interesting, but I'm not sure this is a sermon. Like, where's the Christian part of this? Okay. So in my last about 5 minutes here, let me connect the dots. Because first of all, this is about what it is to be human. All of us are living all of these acts in a way at every moment. We're in different ways. We're all in Act 1, frustrated desire. We're all potentially in Act 2. God has provided us a supporting cast and made us supporting cast in each other's stories. And we are all hoping for Act 3, that somehow, in spite of the odds, in spite of the fact that the opposition gets bigger as the stakes get higher, that our lives are going to end up having a happier ending than we ever could have imagined when we were little children imagining our lives, right? We're all in this. And fundamentally, all it is to be Christian is to be fully human. This is all that Jesus came to do, was to give us fully human lives. So in a way, anything that's fully human, Christians have a stake in. And in a way, to talk about what it is to be fully human is to preach the gospel. Because it turns out this totally is the gospel. So let me try to illuminate that for you. Every great story, oh, by the way, one more thing, I forgot about this slide. We do have to get rid of the other opponent, right? Skinner, the little nasty chef. Skinner is not going to convert. He's never going to be any help. And so what has to happen to Skinner, who's like this principle of just immovable opposition, is he has to get bound and thrown into the outer darkness. And that's exactly what happens. He gets tied up, thrown into the inner darkness of a walk-in refrigerator, and they slam the door. And that's how we get rid of him. So no more opponents, right? Skinner's in a refrigerator. For those of you who have children and are worried about this, they do let him out sort of in the end. But in a real happier ending, right, you would want that part of the opposition, the ringwraith, Sauron, the principle of evil, you would want to know that is being bound and can never interfere with the realization of the mission again. So every great story has both the conversion of an opponent and the happier ending, the banishing of the Skinner figure. So let's just think about how each of these are actually part of what we believe as followers of Christ and are trying to live out as his people in the world. I want to emphasize something about Act 3. Act 3 of every great story, and Act 3 of our own lives, and indeed Act 3 of the whole world story, has to include, I'm borrowing this term from a doctor named John Kabat-Zinn, has to include what I've come to call the full catastrophe. Simple stories, shallow stories, have just a little problem to be solved, a little speed bump. But every life has in it a full catastrophe where everything seems, and sometimes genuinely is, lost. You may have had this. Some dream that awakened but was utterly crushed. You may be living this today. I had a young man come up to me after the last service and describe He said, I'm living the full catastrophe at 35 years old. That's a young man to me. He said, I'm living it. And he described a situation in his life where everything is turned upside down. Catastrophe means basically to turn everything upside down, to upend it all. And if you haven't had it, you will. It's just part of being human. And if there is not a story that it can include the full catastrophe of my life, it's not a story worth telling. And the gospel says there is a full catastrophe. And Jesus has gone to it and through it and emerged on the other side of it. And everything that it meant was borne by him and yet did not overcome him. And great stories don't just have a little speed bump on the road of life, but really put us in touch with the full catastrophe of being human and say, nonetheless, there's hope. Then there's this issue of the conversion of the opponent. It's so important that we believe it's possible for the opponent to switch sides. Why? Well, there's an amazing clue in the movie Ratatouille, in the name of our fearsome opponent, Anton Ego. So we get that, right? Anton, he's the antagonist, he's the opponent. But what about his last name? Ego. Latin word for I, me. Who is my own greatest opponent in realizing the mission that I know I'm on and in being everything that I could be? It's me. I am my own greatest opponent. This is especially true, by the way, for those of us who are artists, creators, people like Remy. I'm a writer. What is it that stops me from being the writer I'm meant to be? It's this little voice inside me that says, I don't like writing, I love it, and if I don't love it, I'm not swallowing it, and pray you don't disappoint me. And there's this voice in me constantly that's criticizing who I am, what I do, saying you're not good enough, you're not real enough, you're not fast enough, whatever it is. Pray you don't disappoint me. And that can be paralyzing to us. And what we most want and need to believe is that that very thing in me can be converted through grace to an ally of being who I'm meant to be. And especially for those of us who have creative callings, that critic, instead of just paralyzing us and shutting us down, could actually become the voice that calls us to excellence, calls us to do our best, knows what best is, and says, you can make it, you can do it, I've seen it. We all have to believe that we ourselves can be converted from our worst enemy to our best friend. At the same time, we have to believe that evil is going to be banished, that the principles of evil in the world that say you will never be enough will be silenced, and it has been bound and banished by Christ. And then the end of every great story is that all things are made new. This is our story. This is the world story. God, who created the world with all these possibilities and put his human image bearers in it as the subjects of his story to bring order and harmony and beauty and flourishing to the world. But who was the opponent in that story? His own image bearers stood in opposition to that call. And then there was a force of evil enticing them, tempting them to say no to that mission, to undermine that mission. And Act 1 of the biblical story ends only a couple pages in with the mission seemingly frustrated and lost. But then God begins to enter the story. And in a way, we live now in the great Act 2, in which a helper is sent who gives us what we never could have had ourselves. We become the receivers of God's grace. God's own Son enters in and does for us what we couldn't do, obeys in the way we couldn't obey, suffers things that we could never bear to suffer, endures the full catastrophe of being human. And on the other side of that, opens up to us the possibility that with his Spirit, who is called in Scripture the helper, the advocate, the one who comes alongside, we can be what we were meant to be. And it ends this way. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, even better than Paris, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, and let's actually read this together. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, See, I am making all things new. As we respond to this, let's just stand in prayer. I want to pray over us, then Kathy's going to come and guide us. Let's just stand and pray together.